Welcome to today's discussion of Soledad in the Desert. My name is James Tyler Chadwell-English, and I am a teen librarian and a West Virginia native. And I am going to allow the panelists here today to introduce themselves, starting with what I consider West Virginia's literary historian, Phyllis Moore.
Thank you, Tyler. I have been researching the literary history since 1985, and the first person that was an author that I actually met was Meredith Sue. So it's partly due to her that I started this research. And we do have a literary map, and she is on it on the front, which is quite an honor. There's 35 authors on it for the 35th state. I'm on the front of it. And there's about 200 authors all told on the map. But there are many more we could add, and we'd like to do that.
Thank you. Donna?
Hi, I'm Donna Meredith, and I'm a retired English and journalism teacher and the author of 6 books and a West Virginia native.
Dr. Pendarvis?
Hi, I'm Edwina Pendarvis, and I am Professor Emeritus at Marshall University here in Huntington. And I'm so glad we're going to be talking about a science fiction book today because I love science fiction.
Meredith?
Yeah, I'm a native of Harrison County, West Virginia. I haven't lived there for a long time, but we still own a house that we're in the process of selling. And I've written, I think, 22 or 23 books. And I'm just really, really looking forward to hearing live human beings talk about my work, because you don't get that very often. Usually you do it all by yourself, and maybe you get a critique or maybe you don't, but it's nice to hear people talk about it.
Phyllis, could you share with us a little bit about the different science fiction as a genre in West Virginia literature, and talk about Meredith Sue on the map? I will be sharing right now the map.
Good.
For folks to see while you're discussing that.
Okay. As you see, there are 35 names. Nobody's actual photographs on the map, and it was created in 2004. And a committee across the state created it, and we had funding pretty much from across the state too. And it's the first official literary map we've ever had. We're real proud of it. And on it, there are some science fiction authors, but we didn't have too many. We now have about 15 that I've identified. And at that time, I probably had only heard of maybe 2. So Meredith Sue's a new in science fiction addition to that particular genre.
Wonderful. Donna, do you want to share a little bit about the science fiction as a genre for those who might not know what that entails?
Sure. I have taught science fiction many times to high school students and have enjoyed teaching it. And I think the kids really enjoy it because it gives them the opportunity to see what the future might look like. It lets them think about things that are not yet in existence, but will be one of these days. For example, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World introduced us to test tube babies long before they actually existed in this world. And kids like reading that sort of thing, and it does open our minds. And I thought that Meredith Sue's Soledad in the Desert does a good job of this, lets us think about what life would be like on another planet. And I thought maybe I saw hints of influence from other science fiction writers like Frank Herbert's Dune series and maybe Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Perns. I saw some similarities in the themes that Meredith Sue dealt with.
Great, thank you. And Meredith Sue, why don't you share if maybe some of that's who maybe did influence you, and then could you briefly describe the novel for folks who may not have read it yet?
Sure. I actually haven't read very much of Anne McCafferty, but I want to look up the Dragon book. I definitely was highly moved by Dune. I don't have a literary agent anymore, but the one I had for many, many years was not very good at handling science fiction, and she had trouble, and she gave up on my science fiction book. And then she did tell me that she had turned down Dune when she was an editor, whenever it came out in the 60s or 70s. She had actually said, no, not for us. So she was at least honest about it. It wasn't her thing. A lot of people can't handle science fiction. They just don't. I mean, my husband is one of them. He wants it to be this world, and he wants to have, these rules. But I have always liked it, especially when I was a teenager. I have less patience for bad writing of all kinds now, so it has to be well-written science fiction for me to read. I really like it to be good. And but for me, all of my writing has, to one way or another, been using the idea of what if. So what if I had grown up as I did in a small town in West Virginia, but what if I had gone out with that boy instead of being a stiff back person and said no. And so science fiction is like a huge what if. What if this happened or that happened? And so for me, that's what's behind it all. And I just love going into different worlds and going far away, both as a reader and as a writer.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to share a photo of the front cover as you describe Soledad in the Desert, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. You want me to keep talking about Soledad?
If you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. Soledad is, it's actually part of a trilogy, it turns out. I wrote the middle book first, and then I so enjoyed the world that I decided to do the prequel. And the backstory, which is given in the first, like a prologue to each book, is the people from Earth sent off a whole mess of starships. Not quite, they knew where they were going, but they really didn't know if they were going to make it, and most of them didn't. And they were there for something like 10 generations. And so when they finally landed on this place that had air and water, first of all, the surviving spaceships, each one had a different culture that had developed over the 10 generations, and they were each, and some of them were really bad, practically slavery situations. The one that Soledad, her group, was a group that had tried to become kind of Zen Buddhists, and all they really wanted to do was sit and meditate. And after various things happening, they escape the bad guys and go out into the desert. And this is about the children who grow up in the desert, and the adults, and what happens to them. And of course, the other books are going to connect it to the other groups of people who landed and lived in various ways. The one trick about this planet where they've landed is, even though it's got water and air, and you can grow certain things if you have the seeds, the native plants and animals have their DNA and their RNA or something is twisted the wrong way, and nothing can be, it's not nutritious for human beings. In fact, it tends to make them sick and kill them. So there's that. And then there also is a sentient race known as the Jaegers. And yes, it is named after Chuck, and it was they fly. They're sort of dragon-y, but not quite. And I guess you can tell by hearing me talk that I really had a good time with it. It's not that it's a happy book; it's kind of a sad book, but I had a good time with it.
Well, great, thank you so much. And now we have 2 more books to look forward to, which is awesome. Okay.
Tyler, may
Yes,
I ask you a question? I'm interested in the glowworms, which, since we're talking about Jaegers, Meredith Sue, have you ever actually been anywhere where there were glowworms?
Not in that book.
Okay.
No, I mean it's actually the middle book, the one that already exists, the City Build of Starships,
Okay.
has a first explanation for it, and the third book I think will explain it more fully. So there's an answer, but it's not in Soledad.
Well, what was amazing is I like books that I learn from, and I know you'd learn a lot of different things from science fiction, but I actually looked up glowworm caves, and there are glowworm caves and glowworm caverns, and there's one in Alabama, and if I did not know that, or I would have visited. It's a cavern, and you're allowed to take a boat down it. And at night, the cavern joins the sky. So I think we all should go to Alabama to the glowworm cavern.
Sounds like a fun trip.
Yeah, it does.
Eddie, would you like to start us off on some discussion of the tropes that you saw in this novel?
Well, sure. And here's how, I mean, the way I think of tropes is just as sort of large metaphors. So that's how I'll be using that term.
Okay.
And science fiction, of course, it's really fun, and it allows you to be creative. I think it's fun to read and probably fun to write. But it also is sort of expected to be more intellectual. Tends,
Really?
Mysteries are more intelligent, in terms of figuring things out. But science fiction you expect to be sort of intellectual. So I was looking, of course, for metaphors for important ideas that were important to humans now and maybe in the future. And I just wondered, there's a guy that talks about every science fiction book having an Eden complex or Eden project. And I wonder, there seem to be lots of biblical references in the book or allusions. And I wondered if they were on purpose, Meredith Sue. Is there any way that you see this novel as concerned with Eden, the loss of Eden or regaining it?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the Eden in this one, I don't think the adults have any illusions about, finding an Eden, but I think the Eden probably is these kids who really are just, I mean, once they get enough to eat, they're living with each other, and they're kind of vaguely protected, and they have these Jaegers that sort of watch them, these giant dragon type animals, and they just make their own world. And so to me, I had a lot of fun with my neighborhood friends when I was a kid, and that actually is a kind of Eden to me. I'm not sure it's what you were talking about, but that's what I would say.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and especially since I've just been kind of researching childhood play in Appalachia, but we'll talk more about that later. But I also love the beautiful, the two suns, one blue and one pink, and then the light is lavender. And I wondered what gave you that idea, and did you have anything that sort of symbolized, at least consciously, that you felt it symbolized?
Oh, Eddie, I think for me it symbolized writing a real science fiction novel. I mean, it was just the idea, like, what would be, you have to figure out what's going to be different and what's going to be the same, what's going to help you remember what this world is like. And I always liked the idea of having a couple of suns. And I actually did more with that in the city build of Starships, which is the same planet. And I spent more time envisioning the lights and the colors and the times of day and everything. But that was just something that pleased me. And I do suspect it's something I got from other science fiction novels. It's a kind of common thing that they use.
Really great opportunity. I mean, it's very rare as a reader, and we're all readers. You can't be a writer without being a reader. And to be able to speak with an author about a book, because we have all these thoughts about books as we're reading them, and hardly ever do we have our questions answered. So this is a really good opportunity, and I want to thank you again, Meredith Sue, for joining us, because this is really great for us. But I also wanted to kind of discuss food and its place in this novel. I mean, not that everyone doesn't eat, but I consider food and foodways to be a centerpiece in Appalachian culture. And you've written a lot about West Virginia and its culture and the experiences that one might have there. Did any of that play into the ideas that you used for food in this novel, or was this just another sort of science fiction element that you got to play with and recreate?
I think for me what was most interesting was gardening more than food. I mean, they don't do much cooking really. They just kind of toss stuff in a pot, and then there's the whole issue of vegetarianism and meat eating and cannibalism and all that. But gardening was something that I rejected as a child. I had a grandfather who always kept a garden. He wanted to be a farmer, but he had to go to the mines. And this was way back. This was my grandfather who was present at the Monongah explosion. And but he always kept a garden. When he lived in Fairmont, he had the most dirtless little backyard. It was all cinders, and he grew things. And I always rejected it. I read books. I didn't do that. But when I moved to New Jersey about 30 years ago, I had space, and I was just going to have some basil and tomatoes. And then I just got really into a little bit of gardening. And even though I have less space now, I still do some. And just the idea of making your own food and what it is what it would take to be self-sufficient and all that sort of thing. That interests me more than cooking. I mean, I like to eat good food, but I was particularly interested here in what would it take to make food for people, to grow food.
That's a really interesting answer, and our paths sort of diverged there. We were a multi-generational family, and we lived in Fairmont, and my grandfather had a huge garden that he built into a hill, because we lived on a hill, because everybody lives on a hill in West Virginia, it feels like. And
We have from the
yes,
garden
Eddie, please
tomatoes.
come back to the cannibalism.
Go ahead, Eddie.
What I think we were intrigued with, Meredith Sue, or at least some of us, was the fact that to make food with the new planet, they had to use fragments of corpses like bones or flesh from buried old worlders, people who had come from the other planet, even if they were 10 generations past. So to me, that link to the old planet in the food was interesting. And I think that, and whether we thought it was cannibalistic or not was, we kind of tossed that around a little bit. But what made you think about having them use flesh from the old people who were buried?
They didn't have. I mean, they could also be alive or fresh. I mean, they don't have to be buried.
Yeah,
Oh, I thought it had. They could have killed somebody, right?
They could have, sure. I'm not sure. I think I was just looking for what was. I've always been interested in the things that are shocking. I mean, it's not that I go around shocking people or anything, but but I've always been interested in the fact that everything has many, many sides to it. So this little novella that I have coming out soon from Kat Plesko's press, that several that I know Phyllis knows, and I mean, it has a relationship that could be considered very shocking between an older woman and a younger boy. And it's just, I mean, anything that some people are offended by, but there are so many other ways of looking at it. And I actually felt that way about the foodstuffs here. Nobody wants to eat, be a cannibal, but yet, wouldn't you if it was, or more to the point, wouldn't you if it was going to save you and your group? It's just that kind of thing.
Right, because some of the little kids had rickets because food was so scared. Nutrition, wasn't nutrition.
Yeah, and the other thing that I worked hard on, that I don't know if anybody gets it or notices it, but I tried really hard that nobody would use language or metaphors that made reference to things that weren't on that planet or weren't within their experience. Because when you're writing, there's like this natural thing to have people say, "Oh, it was hot as Hades." But if you're living in a place where nobody has a belief about Hades or a thought like that, they wouldn't say that. They'd say something else. And I kept catching things. I mean, it's very hard to limit your imagery, actually. And that was another, that along with the details of the world was something I worked on hard.
I as someone who does read science fiction, I really appreciate that. I've been rereading a Star Trek series where they're always making allusions, and they always say, "Oh, that's an allusion to an Earth such and such," and they're aliens who never even visited Earth. And I'm always like, why is that even popping into their brain? So that's something that I really appreciate about your work. Eddie, do you want to talk a little bit about the Jaegers?
Well, I love the Jaegers, but I feel like I'm taking up too much too much of other people's time. But I will ask real quickly, what on earth made you think of having those flying creatures? Of course, once you thought of them flying, calling them Jaegers, but I just think that's such a wonderful insight. I like movies and books with sort of inside jokes, and anybody from West Virginia is going to get that. So what made you think of using the Jaegers and those flying creatures?
Well, okay, I feel like I'm talking too much. You know, I was hoping I was just going to sit back and sip my iced tea and listen to you all talk about my book. One of you asked me by email about this business about, talking back to books. And this is a case where I know exactly what got me started on this world and the Jaegers and everything else. It was a novel I read in high school, because I've actually been writing little stories and notes about this for a long time, but it was a writer who was a very major science fiction writer in the 50s and 60s named Andre Norton. If anybody, can you see that, the book? And it's a woman. She's a woman who was very influential with Ursula Le Guin. And she wrote potboilers. She wrote millions of them. They tended to be a little on the feminist side, although the main characters were almost always men. But this one particular book, and I reread it recently. I got it off the internet, and I couldn't figure out, I still can't figure out why it was this one that got me. But for some reason, this one I wanted to talk back to, and not argue with it, but just live in it. And it had some creatures in it. I guess did they ride dragons? I don't even remember anymore. But at any rate, it was the thing that I was going with was dragons. And then recently I've read some fantasy with dragons. It's not a lot of it, but I like dragons. But it's so obvious, to start doing dragons again. So I tried to make these creatures be different. They only have one eye. They have long hanging hind parts, like the like the serpent in Paradise Lost, and they just and they really they just interested me. And I started out thinking of a time I had seen a seabird called I don't know if it's pronounced Jaeger or Jaeger, the one I mean, a J-A.
Yeah, it's a hawk, kind of. It's a predatory bird.
Right, and the one time I had been on the ocean, I had seen them, and they just float very slowly, and that fascinated me. And all of that, plus the fact that Jaeger, if it's Jaeger, was very close to Chuck Yeager, and I'm kind of making this up as I go, but it is this kind of big stew of stuff that goes together. But the one thing I'm very sure of is that it came from that Andre Norton book, and I've been writing ideas for it for a long time, and never and just recently kind of got rid of the old stuff and just wrote the books.
Fascinated by your story, and I feel like, Donna, we haven't heard enough from you. Is there anything you would like to ask, or any issue or anything about the book you'd like to bring up or discuss?
I think the main thing I would want to ask Meredith Sue would be if she intended this as an indictment of human greed. Is it an indictment of capitalism that's going on with the way these different societies and the different cultural levels are set up in the novel, like the haves, the have-nots, the hands, and the people that are the officers in the city who have everything and they hoard all the wealth?
Yeah, I'm thinking. One of my thoughts was that these groups in their starships one group came out highly hierarchical, as you're describing. One group comes out just like anarchy. I don't mean anarchism. I mean anarchy. They just more or less kill each other, and they're like warlords. And then the one group becomes very religious. It happens to be Buddhism, but they're and so that's definitely on my mind. And the other thing is there an alternative to what most science fiction ends up doing, which is having some kind of, or fantasy, a grand battle at the end? There's a battle between good and evil. And that's been done, and it's interesting. And I'm interested if there's another way, if there's something between evil versus good and, you know, duking it out, or and if there's another way of organizing things. And again, I'm not a political scientist or a philosopher, but I can play with this stuff in fiction.
Phyllis and I briefly discussed when we first started reading the book this idea of recreated societies, because not just science fiction, but all fiction has a long literary history of the idea of recreating societies, like destroying societies and then recreating or moving them somewhere and recreating them. And we've had thousands of years to like hone down what society should look like, and we still don't get it right. And this isn't a question that Meredith can answer or any of us can answer, but you know, like are humans, are we capable as a collective whole of creating a good society, right? One that works for everybody, because if science fiction is any indication, somebody always comes out on top, someone always getting more than someone else, and someone's always a victim one way or another.
Is that for me? May I answer that? Or
Yeah, anybody can.
I mean, I don't have I just wanted to give a plug for a friend of mine who's a science fiction writer, who's not as well known as she should be. Her name is Judith Moffat, and I happen to have a couple of books here. Here's one of her books. And the way she dealt with this was she had the planet turn against people, and they could no longer have children until they straightened things out. So I mean, like there's, you know, like that's the fantasy science fiction element of it. And she worked on it by having the planet actually train the people with the help of some friendly aliens to be better. Now, I don't know if that's a better solution, but at least it's one I hadn't heard before, you know, with it. And yeah, I think, the other thing I wanted to say was it's one definition of the difference between liberals and conservatives, that conservatives don't believe people can ever become good, and you can't trust people. So, you know, there will always be, the poor will always be among us. And liberals supposedly think that society can change people and help them. And I think those are interesting ideas. And, you know, I don't know, who knows how it's going to come out in the end.
One thing I liked was you had the older seekers who were extreme Buddhists and didn't seem to want anything, you know, like nothingness for them. But Leon and Soledad were kind of like a pivot point, with Soledad leaning more toward the pacifistic and Leon leaning more toward the wanting more, like the Jaegers say humans do, that they want more. So I'm eager to see what balance works out, because it's not answered, of course, in these books. We don't know what's going to happen for sure with, you know, what will happen to Soledad and what will happen to Espera. But I like that pivot point, which seems to be between those extremes that they form. And I think we should be sure to tell readers that there is sex in the novel.
Not for children.
We don't want to make it sound too intellectual.
Intellectual.
In the spirit of keeping this down to 30 minutes, is there any last comments anyone would like to make before we wrap up?
I would like to make one. I really would like to compliment Meredith Sue on how she wrapped the novel, you know, with the beginning and the ending all coming together. And I think it would be a good tool to teach people, you know, how to write a novel, science fiction or not.
Thank you, Phyllis.
You're welcome.
You should consider teaching a seminar you can charge for, Meredith Sue.
Oh, yeah, really.
That's what people do. Anything else from anyone else?
I just wanted to thank you all for reading the book and you know, and talking about it, because it's a true pleasure to know that people have read something closely and actually you know, hear what one says. Really like that.
Well, we really enjoyed it and appreciate you talking to us about it. And I just want to say again, we're really